We offer you deep historical information from history on YouTube channel. Subscribe. Now don't forget to turn on notifications. The program under which the Germans killed 300,000 disabled people. Action T4. Children on their way to the ordered place, not knowing that their right to life would soon be taken away. At the end of the 1930s, dark forces carried out a secret and extraordinary operation targeting certain disabled children. The program was organized by Philipp Bühler, and Hitler's doctor, Karl Brandt, directed it. A total of 300,000 disabled people were deliberately deprived of their lives in the so-called Action 4 programme. The code name T4 came from the address of the coordinating office in Berlin, Tiergartenstrasse 4. In his book Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler clearly expressed the Nazi ideology. In order to create an Aryan race, rotten people should be weeded out and healthy. Hardy Germans suitable for work and military service should be produced, and this is exactly what Hitler wanted to do. As soon as he came to power in 1933, he introduced compulsory sterilization of the physically and mentally handicapped. Laws were introduced. The law to prevent children with hereditary diseases, people with visual impairments, hearing impairments, epilepsy were sterilized, many of them subjected to unspecified tests. Obsessed with racial purity, the Nazis did not want to suffer these problems for generations to come. Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal physician, and Hans Lammers, his Minister of State, emphasized that people deemed useless should be openly segregated from society in order to advance the regime. In early 1939, Richard Kretschmar was appointed Chancellor of the Nazi Party. A few months ago, I had a son with missing limbs, blind eyesight, incurable physical and mental disabilities. His name is Gerhard, and I ask for your permission to legally euthanize him. Kretschmar had to go on. In fact, he asked Hitler's permission to kill this monster, as he called it. Hitler sent his own doctor Karl Brandt to Kretschmar's home to examine the case, and he confirmed that the diagnosis was correct and that the baby had no hope of recovery. So Gerhard Kretschmar was euthanized on 25 July 1939 with an injection, the cause of death listed on his death certificate as heart failure. This letter, dated 1st September, and kept at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, was signed by Hitler authorizing the euthanasia program. In August 1939, the Reich's Ministry of the Interior, a decree was issued requiring doctors, nurses, and midwives to report all children under the age of 3 who showed signs of serious mental and physical problems. And 3 months later, health workers began pressuring families with disabled children, their children. They insisted on sending them to a series of private children's hospitals in Austria and Germany. They lied to the families that only the clinics could provide the kind of care that disabled children should receive, when in fact the clinics were infanticide wards. Infanticide wards. Specialized medical staff would kill children in the clinics by overdosing them with drugs or starving them to death, but they could not tell the parents directly. When the state found out that parents had discovered that the government was killing their children, they knew that there would be no soft response, that these lies could distract the families for a while. The aim of the Nazi euthanasia program was to exterminate the mentally and physically disabled. In the Nazi view, this would allow the Aryan race to eliminate people who were genetically defective and a financial burden on society. Cleanse the body. The term euthanasia literally means a good death, and is usually used to mean the painless death of a chronically or terminally ill person who would otherwise have suffered, thus relieving them of their suffering. But in the Nazi context, euthanasia was a way of concealing the murder program. To conceal the murder program. T4 initially included only babies and children, but as the scope of the measure expanded, it came to include all people up to the age of 17. By the end of T4, it included all disabled adults and the elderly. Within 3 weeks of Gerhard Kretschmar's assassination, a fully fledged bureaucracy had spread throughout Germany, and the situation had been communicated to all health professionals. The Hereditary and Congenital Diseases Program, led by Brandt and Philipp Bühler, Hitler had also authorized the establishment of the Reich Committee for Scientific Registration. These men soon put their deadly plan into action. After each birth, officials filled out a form with a section where they had to write down the physical or mental defects of the baby. A total of 3 doctors checked the forms, and if they decided that the baby should die, they put a cross on the paper. The doctors suddenly became murderers. They decided people's futures. 2 out of 3 doctors had to agree. Under the guise of helping the baby get medical treatment, the baby was taken from its parents and T4 was activated. Some of this group, considered by the Nazis to be useless eaters, were taken to specially constructed gas chambers, while others were subjected to systematic starvation. Gassing facilities. These were set up in Berlin, Saxony, in southwest Germany, and on the Danube in Austria. Heinrich Himmler had personally seen the gassed people and liked the method so much that it was used many times during the final solution on his orders, disguised as showers. In the gas chambers, which used bottled pure carbon monoxide gas, workers collected people's ashes and placed them in an urn to be sent to relatives. The families or guardians of these people would receive a document and an urn with a fictitious cause of death. Under Nazi occupation for thousands of mentally ill people in Eastern Europe, the last thing they saw was the Nazi police. With the outbreak of war in September 1939, they expanded their goal of extermination. Mental hospitals across Poland were emptied by members of the SS and patients were shot. If you lived in Germany 80 years ago and had the following characteristics, you would have died: schizophrenia, epilepsy, dementia, and other chronic psychiatric and neurological disorders, non-German or related blood, more than 5 years in psychiatric institutions. Those who remained. The program was typical of the chaotic nature of Hitler's government. The Third Reich could develop such a program spontaneously overnight, or if it was something that had been mentioned but postponed, it was just as likely to be activated in a day or two. This policy. The bureaucrats wanted the state to spend these funds on loans for newlyweds, higher salaries for soldiers, etc., rather than on convicts or people who were rotten. Hermann Pfannmüller, a doctor, experimented on starving children. He specialized in killing slowly, believing that a harsh chemical to stop the heart would be more natural and painless. The Austrian actress Frieda Richard was one of the few survivors of the Hadamar Euthanasia Center. Frieda had been in a concentration camp in Poland during the war. She died in September 1946, shortly after the war ended. It did not take long for the Germans to learn of the mass murder of adults and children. The deaths could not be kept a state secret. There were many citizens, many doctors who objected to T4. They were afraid that the SS would come and get them. The protests spread throughout Germany and reached the churches. Both the Protestant and Catholic churches declared that the program was a moral disgrace and that no excuse could cover up the crime. The Nazi Party had always had a difficult relationship with Germany's religious communities, perhaps not to the end, but the church represented a separate and largely independent force at the heart of what was fast becoming a dictatorial system. In the end, what happened in the death centers? The families of the victims all had almost exactly the same experience. Then some families receive letters, if the patients are able to write, and finally they receive letters saying that their loved ones have died of measles, and that their bodies were going to be cremated, and the notice said that they were being cremated as a sort of sanitary measure. When people woke up, the churches raised their voices to raise awareness, and even distributed leaflets against the T4 program. They began to resist. After the protests, Hitler ordered the euthanasia program to be stopped in August 1941. But the end of T4 did not mean the end of the killing. The euthanasia of children continued as before. It was the last days of the Second World War, and in those days, just before the end of the program, it even applied to foreign workers, war-wounded and geriatric patients. By the time it was all over, 300,000 people had lost their lives, almost all of them Germans or Austrians. They were all Germans or Austrians, although it is not clear how many died, and the number could have been much higher. Hermann Pfannmüller was tried in Munich for euthanasia. 2 years after his trial, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison, later reduced to 4 years, and died in Munich in 1961. On 20 August 1947, Dr. Karl Brandt was sentenced to death at the Nuremberg trial. Only some of the Nazis were able to face justice. Philip Buhler was caught after the war, but chose to commit suicide with his wife. Along with Dr. Brandt, several other doctors were sentenced to death. The eugenics movement has many supporters, especially in the USA, among whom the proportion of educated people is not to be underestimated. We offer you deep historical information from history on YouTube channel. Subscribe. Now don't forget to turn on notifications.